Twitch stream in just a moment. Chat, you should be able to see us momentarily.
There's an ad for me.
Always with the ads.
I know.
I had to remember to mute my mute my stuff because I was tuned in the background. But yeah, folks in chat, let us know if you can see and hear us a-okay.
Lizette, you're a dream if you can hear me. Thank you so much for all of your commentary.
But yeah, we should be back. We should be loud and clear.
Yes. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, should I wait or should I go back to the slide? Just can hear and see two of us so far. Is there a person you can't hear or see?
Really? Oh, I don't think Casper has said anything yet.
I am here. I'm hoping that everyone can see. You know, we're trying to do that seamless transition from Derek hosting the stream to me, and obviously it was beyond seamless there. So apologies, everyone, for the hiccup.
We're good.
All good.
All right. Well, my understanding is you all saw the Saeed slide, which sounds like a really great dance move someone should invent. Just 1 second. Let me respond to, just kidding. Okay, we're good. Let's see. I was just notified that someone from NHK is watching right now.
Hey.
Great.
Yeah. How about that?
Right, well.
So I will jump back into my slides if I have screen sharing abilities.
Got him?
I do. I sure do.
All right.
Hold tight for my meta moment where I toggle back over to slides. Nope. That's classic. Okay. All right, friends, we're back at the very photogenic Edward Said and his monumental book, Orientalism, which, as I was saying, and hopefully you caught, you can find a copy of this pretty much everywhere. And this really is the basis of our conversation. Edward Said, a Palestinian-American gentleman who really founded this entire study of post-colonial theory and is such an important thinker, kind of building off, if you are familiar with other philosophers, Foucault. So yeah, if you're interested in these things, you can follow them back. But Edward Said's ideas are far more specific and honed in on a particular time in history. So, all right. Then, in a nutshell, what is Orientalism? It can't be defined in a nutshell, but here I'm going to try. So my best, shortest definition is the representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, in a stereotyped way that is regarded as embodying a colonialist attitude. And so when we say a colonialist attitude, I hope everyone out there knows what I mean when I say that in terms of colonizing others. So the kind of attitudes you would need to carry in order to enforce power on another group of people. So this is also a strong juxtaposition of these two terms that he uses that are very important and used widely in this study called the Orient and the Occident. So this is a little bit important because you'll hear this term Occident, and I think this isn't as known of a term. I think people are familiar with this term, the Orient, but the Occident actually refers to a term that's borrowed from Latin, which translates to sunset. And the sunset, which can be seen from a perspective of a fixed point, means west. So that said, anyone at a point in the world can see the sun always rises from the east and sets in the west. And it kind of follows that the west is located somewhere where the sun sets. So basically, this is all to say that that doesn't mean anything. The west is completely arbitrary, just like that meridian line we talked about earlier. Someone just chooses where they're seeing the sun go down, and that's east and that's west. But all this is to say the Occident means the West, and with a capital W for our purposes here. And the Orient, of course, means the East. But in the original understanding of this term, Orient, it really was specific to the Middle East and Central Asia. And so you're wondering, how is this relevant to Japan? But we shall get there, friends. But also to note that this study really takes off and I think has a starting point right after Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in the late 1700s, moving into 1800. And that's a very important moment to study because it really shows how Orientalism is created. So here's a more specific map of the Orient and the Occident. noting that this red area that's considered the Orient, this is very malleable depending on who you ask. And I think that's very telling of the kind of study we're looking at. Sometimes it also encompasses parts of Northern Africa. Sometimes it doesn't include Japan. Sometimes it doesn't include Russia. So it really changes over time. And I would say this is a more contemporary to date view of Orientalist, or the Orientalist kind of vicinity in this swath of an idea. And so you may have seen this on the cover of the Orientalism book. And so I wanted to make sure we could come back to this artwork. And of course, you know, this show was created by the Japanese Arts Foundation, and I'm an art historian. So how could I not bring in some artwork for us all to look at?
It's the best part.
And no, what's that?
It's the best part.
Oh, I'm so glad you feel that way. But this is not Japanese art, but this is really important in helping everyone understand, and myself included, how Japanese art is understood in the quote unquote West moving forward. So this is called the snake charmer. And as I had mentioned, Napoleon invaded Egypt, however successfully, around, you know, the 1800 marker. And the thing that's really special about this particular moment is he understood the intrinsic value of creating media around military force. So when he invaded Egypt, he didn't just go and put a flag down or something like this. He also brought soldiers, right? But also researchers, scholars, cartographers, artists. So everyone is here in Egypt in some degree to record, quote unquote, you can't see my air quotes, record what's happening there and to disseminate that information to the rest of the world. And so, you know, I think, you know, when we think about Japan, we sometimes call things like this soft power, but it's so important, right? And so here's an artist, you know, there's a lot that were funded by Napoleon to create images. And Jerome actually did visit parts of the Middle East, though I think it's pretty easy to say that this is a completely fabricated moment that he's capturing here. And some of the things that are very typical to Orientalist painting and Orientalist thought is here, this is a very almost like photorealistic painting, right? And it's really important to be so photorealistic if you want people to believe it. So this style of art was really, really popular in helping these ideas move forward. So you can see that, of course, we have this, you know, naked boy holding a snake. These men are just watching. The tile once was beautiful, but now it's in total disarray. You know, so there's a lot of things being said here without saying too much overtly, right? And, you know, people are just laying about, no one's really doing anything. And so this, in conjunction with some imperialistic ambitions, helps people from these home countries feel like, oh, well, we need to help them. Look at them. They need help. That boy needs clothes, right? So this is kind of how these ideas are built. And this is another one, again, by Jerome. I just wanted to follow up with that. And there's a couple tropes for Orientalist art and thought. And sexualization, fetishization, harems, and just really the consumption of women is so part and parcel with Orientalism. This is one here. And I feel like there's just so many things you can even say about this painting, right? One, who is this woman?
Right.
She has, you know, a servant with her, bathing her. So somehow these two women together are important, you know. This is what needs to be conveyed out of anything in this region. And I think it's just very interesting. And again, with the tile that's run down in this space, but then we have this woman, just, you know, these two women are here just for us to enjoy watching them, really, in a scene that we shouldn't be able to see.
And those shoes are just striking as well, or sandals. I'm assuming that's what they are in the bottom right-hand corner.
I know those aren't Geta, but they look like some of those ones that Oidan would wear. The really tall, you're familiar. Right. I don't know enough about this particular place and time to know if these shoes are accurate or something that Jerome imagined. I'm not sure. And so, hey, yep, more harems, more ladies. And I know that this particular image isn't the best, but I chose it because most of the other representations of this painting are quite dark and it's very difficult to see what's happening. So I apologize for this very odd representation of this painting by Ong. Ong never visited Turkey, never left France for the most part. However, he did create this very, very indulgent scene with women, right? And moving forward, I want to say too that some of the images I'm showing here in these paintings are a bit graphic and a bit triggering for some. So give me about 5 more minutes if you might be bothered by some triggering images of women moving forward. I do want to note this. So
I do see that Guy C847 is only seeing the map right now. I want to make sure that everyone else can see the pieces of art that Sarah's been sharing here as well.
Yeah, I would say try refreshing the browser. I do see everything coming in as intended on Twitch side.
oh, I shouldn't refresh my browser though.
No.
Okay, thank goodness. Okay. Yeah, so if you can't see, I can help describe this for you. Or Casper or Derek, how would you describe the scene?
Well, to put it succinctly, there are a lot of naked women in what seems to be a bathhouse or some sort of, I wouldn't go so far as to say a brothel, but I know those types of things were painted. There are many depictions of those types of things in paintings as well. But yeah, there's tons and tons of women about, not only bathing, but lounging, spreading incense, it seems, or like aromatherapy for somebody else's hair, playing instruments, drinking tea, all sorts of just I don't know. It seems like a pretty great time as far as like a lounge. Yeah. So
unless the temperature was what the temperature is in Chicago right now.
Yeah.
Oh goodness.
So
never
and
mind.
I think it's interesting. There's very specifically women of darker skin color as well, and some of them playing the instruments seem to be not as being as leisurely, I would say, as the others.
Yep.
That's a really good observation, actually, because I do think that they're trying to make a note that there are also servants in this room, people who are not enjoying themselves, perhaps,
Right.
but actually at the service of others. And there's lots of blonde women in here. I think there's a lot of questions for me, but let's say Ang or any of these other Orientalist painters, if they were to go there, I think you can pretty much count on them not being allowed admission to anything like this. There's no way that they'd be allowed into these kinds of situations. So it is for certain completely fabricated. This is an imaginative moment, but anyone who would go to the Louvre to see this, or to see at the Paris Salon, they might take this as like, oh, this person is affiliated with Napoleon and has some authority here, so this just must be what it's like. We need to get these ladies out of here. They're just not doing anything, right? And here's a less lovely one. This is Eugene Delacroix, and this is The Death of Sardanapalus. And this is a really important one because I want to know, this is another way that women, rather than in the harems that we've seen and the kind of like the voyeuristic exoticism that we've seen, there's also some violence involved. This is actually an older tale, and I want to note, I'm going to call it a tale, because this is actually the story of an Assyrian ruler, Sardanapalus, and it's a tragic one, so it's kind of no wonder that this tale maybe attracted Delacroix, but also Lord Byron, who was a very famous writer in the 1800s, had just retold this story in one of his anthologies, so it kind of became popular again, this particular rendition. But the story actually comes from 876 BC. So when I call it a story, I feel like, a lot of these events are probably 30 degrees of separation as to what really happened here, right? So, but according to the legend, I will call it a legend rather than, the events. Sardanapalus was one of the last great kings of a city between the Mediterranean Sea and the Caspian Sea, which is present-day Iraq. His concubines, including his favorite ones, and his horses and his slaves were all burned and destroyed at his will, because his city was under attack by a rebellious enemy group. And instead of facing that humiliating defeat, he decided that he would instead destroy everything, including these women, including, you can see his horses are being killed, different things here, and just kind of considering this a giant funeral pyre in some way for himself. But this is completely outside of the realm of anything you'd ever actually see in Iraq, right? I mean, in any time. And so this also made the Paris Salon, although it did get mixed reviews from people. They were like, this is too graphic. Oh my goodness, what is happening here? The violence, the gore, you know. But, you know, a lot of what we're talking about in current events today is how women are understood from Asia and the United States. And so I think that, you know, some of these paintings and some of these ways of wanting to see Asia are really important to bring up. And not that we see harems anywhere else and things that we know now. Never. Never. So going back here, and just to recall that Orientalism was written in 1978. So Said took great issue with the academic world of writers and researchers that were building this narrative. And, you know, if he were to like read a book, he mentions this in his book, that if he were to read a book about the Middle East or the Orient, or if anyone would who had any interest in learning about the Middle East, this is the only narrative they would find, because this is the only narrative that's ever been written for people who are outside of the Middle East. So that's really troubling. It's almost impossible, as Said would have said, for an American to view the Orient in any other way, because this is the only dialogue, this is the only narrative that's out there. There's no conflicting story. And so thinking about how we get information and about, you know, at this time in 1978, this academia was the popular culture, was defining what things meant for everyone. But now we have an unlimited supply of resources and ideas and opinions and news, quote unquote, and histories being told. So it's even more difficult to pick apart what we're actually seeing and what's at play when we look at them, and how we can decide which source is most reliable. So this is a lot, and I'm sorry I couldn't say more about Orientalism than this, but I want to make sure that we have time to introduce our next speakers. And in a moment, we will be, let me actually escape out of here, because I think we've all seen enough of this image. So let me bring back everybody. So I'm really glad that you guys didn't ask too many questions I didn't get to, but if you do have questions about Orientalism, if you have questions about those paintings, those artists, about the kind of researchers and cartographers and how those individuals added to these kind of positions of power and created something that was much more enduring in terms of leadership, please do ask them. I'm here for it.
Yes, slough those out.
Yes, but as much as I'm here for it, so are the other speakers that we have today, who are so amazing and important. I really can't say enough. The next speaker that we're going to welcome in is Dr. Kurt Hansman. And Dr. Kurt Hansman is a specialist in Chinese painting from 10th to 14th centuries, who has taught courses in Chinese, Japanese, and Asian American art at DePaul University for 25 years. Hansman has spent a decade living and traveling in East and Southeast Asia, and she is a metal tiger. It's one of my favorite things about her. So let's welcome in Kurt.
Kurt will be admitted and is joining now. Hey, Kurt.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So we have Kurt Hansman with us, which is really such a gift. For all of you who haven't been able to take a class with her at DePaul, I'm so sorry for each and every one of you.
Yes, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to get to chatting.
Great. So I'm going to, please bear with me as I'm going to have to switch back and forth between screens. So please, everyone, bear with me.
Certainly.
I'm sorry for this technological difficulty.
It's been a night of them.
Yeah, it couldn't be any worse than what I caused earlier. So
You didn't cause it.
Fear not.
I would like to assume that there's a lot of empathy in chat, as most of us are living in a Zoom lifestyle.
Right. So my presentation this evening is related to the act of war that was the December 7th surprise bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese naval forces. It was a surprise strike against the US, who was a neutral country at the time. The Japanese announced a declaration of war later on the day of December 7th, and the US formally entered the war on December 8th. I'd like to talk about the experiences of those who living in Pearl Harbor first, then talk about the US government attempt to justify a incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese citizens and resident aliens living on the West Coast in a propaganda film, and then talk about a book by an artist, a graphic artist, Mini Akubo, who pushed back against that justification in a documentary work of images and text. So let's first hear from Daniel K. Inoue, who was a young high school student in 1941 on December 7th. He lived about 2 miles from Pearl Harbor, and this is his memory of the experience. Again, I'm sorry, please bear with me as I shift my screen. Sorry, I forgot I have to share my screen.
No worries.
I'm just more nervous now because there were technical difficulties. Sorry, everyone.
It is okay. Chat, one of the things to be mindful of is, definitely keeping the conversation at the front of your mind. If you have any questions that come up, feel free to loft them in chat, because I will be collecting what I can for not only Dr. Hanson, but everybody else on the show.
Everybody hear this and see it?
There is no audio. I think in order to present on Zoom, make sure to select the play or share audio, which is kind of a slightly hidden option.
Yeah, I see that. Okay, so I'm now going to go back and share this audio.
I lived about 15 miles from Pearl Harbor. From there, you can see the air activity and the smoke and the fire.
So you were at home?
And then, oh yes, this was Sunday. And as we do every Sunday, we were preparing ourselves to go to church. My mother was a very, very devout Methodist. And so I would be putting on my necktie. At that moment, I recall, I was putting on a necktie because a necktie was very significant. I wore a necktie only for funerals, weddings, and church. That's all. And the same applied to shoes. I went to school barefooted. Not after that. See, that was one of the big changes. I wore shoes every day after December the 7th. It's a big change in my life. That sounds insignificant to most people, but it was a significant change. And then all of a sudden, while listening to the music, this voice comes across. The disc jockey stops the music, and he starts in a high-pitched voice talking about, this is for real, this is for real, it is not an exercise. What in the world is he talking about? The Japanese are attacking Pearl Harbor. Japanese. Bombs are dropping. And so my father was in the next room, and I went to him and I said, I think we should go out there. So we went out into the street looking towards Pearl Harbor, and sure enough, you can see the smoke rising. And all of a sudden, 3 planes flew overhead. They had made their bombing run and, just going out to the ocean side. And it was gray in color with the red sun. And I knew right away something was going to happen to all of us. I personally thought the world that I knew was coming to an end. And it did.
So that is Daniel K. Inouye's response to his experience of the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Inouye at the time was a young journalist, a high school journalist. He wrote about this experience. When Japanese American citizens were allowed to enlist in the Army, he became an Army first lieutenant. His unit was one of the most decorated in World War II, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor by President Clinton on June 21st, 2001. Inouye's experience was in no way unusual. A reminder that he said at some point, the 7th day of December seemed almost like a nightmare to me. And as long as I live, I will never forget this day. I personally thought that the world that I knew was coming to an end, and it did. This experience of Japanese Americans was not uncommon. Another Japanese resident alien living in New York, an artist, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, wrote to his friend George Biddle in December of 1941. He said, as you probably realize, the world condition as it is today has, in my particular case, produced a very awkward and trying situation. Notice how he underlines that expression. A few short days have changed my status in this country, although I myself have not changed at all. 15 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Life magazine came out with a special issue. Let's look inside. On page 82, I think, there is this illustration headlined, How to Tell a Jap from the Chinese. It gives a highly discredited ethnographic racist mapping of facial features, comparing a Chinese public servant at the top and the characteristics of his face to a Japanese warrior below, who was, in truth, the leader of the Japanese enemy forces. Yet these points of comparison were intended to give Americans a way to somehow be able to tell visually who was an enemy and who was a friend.
Kurt, could I ask you to go into full screen mode with your presentation? I think people could see the images a little more.
Sure. Is that better? Can you see them now?
I think there's an option on your PowerPoint. Yes, that's perfect. Thank you so much. So sorry to interrupt you.
So here we have the points of comparison of these two faces, doing highly charged ethnographic and incorrect measurements. I'm going to zoom back out here because I'm going to move on. On February 19th, President Roosevelt published Executive Order 9066, which was the Japanese American internment order. I'm going to make this presentation available. This is a very easy order to look up, but the gist of this order is that the Secretary of War is authorized to provide, is authorized to move residents who it deems dangerous to the war effort to places far away from the coast, specifically the coasts of Washington, Oregon, and California. And while no racial groups are mentioned or ethnic groups are mentioned in this executive order, it affected Japanese American citizens most profoundly. I'm going to share another video, which is about 9 minutes long, which is a propaganda video trying to explain the removal of Japanese citizens and alien residents to internment camps. Please bear with me as I again move to my screen, a different screen, and play this United States government explanation of the incarceration. And I hope that I have, can you see it?
Yeah, is this something that would be played like at film reels before, like movies and whatnot?
This would have been, yes, this would have been played in huge movie theaters.
Mhm.
Remember that people used to not watch movies on their any kind of small screen.
No
These
one
are
should
huge
ever watch
movies.
movies on small screens. That's
I
just
agree with that. It's my daughter bought me a television just so that I could watch them on a larger screen. These were huge palaces, movie palaces that exist still in Chicago and in most large cities. And people would go and see these newsreels. So this is a way for the government to explain what they thought they were doing. And as we watch this film, I'd really like people to think about how it makes its point. And I'd especially like to ask people to think about the music, the imagery, the way that this process is being presented, and the images that have been selected, and also the vocabulary that's used in persuading people that this is a necessary thing. So let's watch this. It's about 9 minutes. Just how they switch between vaguely orientalizing music. I'm sure Sarah talked about Orientalism, and more martial European or American style music in that first little snippet. I mean, I can talk over this and point these things out.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, our West Coast became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Now, here at San Francisco, for example, convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels occupied almost exclusively by Japanese were within a stone's throw of a naval air base, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why
the suggestion here is, of course, that if there were a Japanese invasion, that Japanese aliens and citizens would immediately join forces with the invading Japanese.
The commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. The trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis. Thereafter, the American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made their plans in accordance with Army orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. Civilian physicians made preliminary medical examinations. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property. Now, this aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees. Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advance contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert. Their own physicians took precautions to guard against epidemics. They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups. They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently. Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lath house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply. At Parker, they undertook the irrigation of fertile desert lands. Meanwhile, in areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
So that is a very easy film to find on YouTube or on the internet, and I think it's worth your time to go back and listen to it again, and think about the kind of language that's used in the film. The workarounds for the joining together of loyal American citizens and possible enemies into one large group to be incarcerated together, kept away from normal society, American society. Although, as the narrator says, 60% of these people were American citizens. I'm going to share my screen again and say that the incarceration was justified largely in visual narrations. The commander of the Western Command mentioned by Eisenhower in the film was a general named John DeWitt. And he saw the Japanese race as an enemy and did not believe that Japanese who had become US citizens could have become American. DeWitt, to DeWitt, the Japanese population was a tight-knit racial group, which he believed were disloyal to America. And he could not see any way of distinguishing loyal and disloyal Japanese citizens. He once said, as I'm reading at the bottom of the screen, and I'll zoom in on it, all Japanese look alike, and those charged with the enforcement of the regulation of excluding alien enemies from the restricted areas will not be able to distinguish them. The danger of the Japanese was and is now espionage and sabotage. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty. You need not worry about the Italians, except in certain cases. Also the same for the Germans, except in individual cases. But we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map. General DeWitt is talking about a population 60% of whom are citizens of this country. There were aliens and citizens from each of the Axis powers living in the US during World War II. 110 to 120,000 of them were Japanese and Japanese Americans, Japanese resident aliens and American citizens who were forcibly relocated from the West Coast. By contrast, there were 11,507 Germans and German Americans were incarcerated during the war. Of the almost 70,000 Italian enemy aliens in the United States in 1942, only 1,881 were taken into custody and detained under the wartime restrictions. German and Italian citizens or resident aliens were permitted to become naturalized citizens. Japanese resident aliens were not permitted to become American citizens. And Japanese constituted 64% of the total of incarcerated individuals during the Alien Exclusion Act, while only 36% of the total incarcerations were Italian or German or other aliens from other enemy powers. Why am I using the term incarceration rather than the more typical internment? That the word internment is used in the film. And one of the destabilizing and strategies that was employed by the federal government was to not really speak the truth, to use euphemistic language, such as the Japanese were evacuated, as if they were evacuated from a natural disaster. They were evacuated from their homes, sent to assembly centers, which sounds relatively benign, and to relocation centers, which sounds almost like one's moving house. these names and these terms kind of gloss over the violence of this act, that we're basically concentrating people in prison-like settings. And so today it has been very much more customary to use terms like incarceration and to diminish the use of this euphemized language. There were many artists active, Japanese American artists active prior to World War II, who had settled on the West Coast. And many of them resisted this narrative that has been presented by their government. One of the most important, I think, is someone who is not as well known as she should be, and that is Mine Akubo, who is shown here in a self-portrait of 1941 and a photograph of 1946, when her book, Citizen 13660, was published. Most of the book, Citizen 13660, was first published in an issue, a 1944 number called the Nippon or Nihon number of Fortune magazine, which the stated goal of which was to make visible the twisted Japanese mind. Despite this stated goal, Akubo's drawings and documentary reportage was published in this magazine and later published in 1946 as a freestanding book. It really didn't get very much traction when it was first published, but came to be an important work in the 1980s when Akubo and others testified before the US Congress in support of reparations to those citizens who had been incarcerated. And reparations were ultimately granted and an apology was made in the 1960s. I want to show you just a few images from Mine Akubo's book. And I'd like to also really highly recommend that you read this book or view this book, which is, I guess this fits a little bit into Tokyo House Party and anime manga, because Akubo is using or developed a style of visual and textual storytelling in combination for this work. Consider the title first. What does it mean? Citizen 13660. What an interesting title. Here's the title page, and we see that drawings and text are by Mine Akubo, and it was published by the University of Washington Press. It was written, or it was done in memory of her mother. And it begins when Akubo, a graduate student at the University of California, Berkeley, had gone to Europe on an overseas exchange program, much like the exchanges that many of you probably have experienced. So Akubo is in Europe when England and France declare war on September 3rd, 1939. And she'd been traveling in Europe on a fellowship and was confronted with this declaration of war. She decides that she has to go home. She has very little money. Her friends help her get on a boat, and she travels back home to the United States. Sorry, I unshared my screen accidentally.
No problem.
Forgive me, bear with me. I'm so sorry. I'm going to wrap this up here in just a minute. I don't want to take up everybody's time. So she gets off the boat, arrives in New York, with 25 cents in her pocket, and was able to go home to California. But her mother dies very shortly after this. And she found herself on the road again with her younger brother going back to Berkeley, to the university. On December 7th, she and her brother, also an artist whose name is a wonderful artist in his own right, Benji Akubo, are sitting, much as Daniel Inouye was sitting, listening to the radio and hear the announcement of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, having breakfast. They were shocked. We wondered what this would mean. They wondered what it would mean for them. One of the marvelous things about Akubo's book is its point of view. She writes in, it's a kind of double I point of view. By this I mean that she writes in the first person. Much of the text is in the first person, but Akubo herself appears in all but two of the drawings, so that she is not only placing herself as the first person narrator in the text, but she's placing herself into the experience that she's drawing across the pages of the book. And we always recognize Mine by her very characteristic um, hairstyle, which is sticking out every which way. She wears all different sorts of clothes, but often wears textiles that are sort of reminiscent, I think, of Japanese textiles that would have been available. So it's always interesting to see where Mine puts herself and how she shows us about the experience. And that's what she's doing in this book. And this is how she's pushing back against the narratives of the newspapers and the propaganda films that are being shown in movie theaters, in things that are being published all over. Here, in one of the most interesting drawings of that occurs very early on in the book, she stands with her hands placed on the top of a newspaper. She, for only very few drawings in the book, does she look directly out at us. But I think here she looks directly out at us, and I wonder what you think she's thinking. Well, we know what she's thinking, but I think what she's doing is confronting the viewer and saying, you are complicit in this. You are partially, if you are saying these things, you are responsible. She's so tired. She's so sad. She's reading the newspaper, and this is the kind of things that she's hearing. Alien citizens, a Jap is a Jap. Berlin, Rome, Tokyo. Black Dragon tribe. Sabotage. We don't want Japs. Evacuate from vital areas. Stab us in the back, Jap. Enemy. All attention, Japs. Firecrackers found in home near airport. Can't trust them. Bank freezing Jap assets. Sorry, no Japs. Spying. Such horrifying things are just rumbling through her head here. And when she gets on a bus, she is isolated, perhaps with one other Japanese, perhaps citizen or resident alien, being stared at by all of the other people on the bus who are clearly people of Caucasian or European descent. And these two are isolated. Notice how she constrains the view and makes us so uncomfortable. This is the visual resistance to the cheerful, we can do it, cooperative narrative that was being promoted in newspapers and propaganda films. Other images for the relocation centers looked very well organized and moving right along, and completely kind of innocuous type of places. But one thing that we notice in Akubo's book, especially during the first parts of the book, is the consistent, ubiquitous presence of weapons, of the military police at carrying guns. Here they frame Akubo in the center of the drawing. Here one points almost directly across her point of vision, on the shoulder of a soldier. And these weapons are consistently seen throughout. These are not things that we saw once in the film, this idea of armed military presence within this process. Akubo and her brother packed up their belongings, and one of the things that happened at these registration sites is that people were given labels for their belongings, and they were registered, and their names were taken away. They were given a number, purportedly because there are so many similar Japanese names, and that people would not be able to tell one Japanese family from another. So Akubo and her brother, a family unit, were given the number 13660. Technically, they weren't allowed to put their name on their baggage, but Akubo here again resists and subverts the ideas of or the practices of the relocation, and adds their last name, Akubo, in addition to their number 13660. And it's here that we find out why the book is called Citizen 13660. They go and look at their home, saying goodbye, and they leave. And are taken to Tanforan racetrack, to really terrifyingly bad quarters. They're constantly spied on. And again, we see here Akubo resisting and subverting. In one drawing, she says, curfew was imposed and roll was held every day at 5:45 a.m. and 6:45 p.m. Each barrack had a house captain who made the rounds to check on us twice a day. And here the house captain is outside the wall, and Akubo sticks her tongue out at him as she's sitting at her desk painting. Day and night, Caucasian camp police walked their beats within the center. Caucasian was the camp term for non-evacuee workers. They were on the lookout for contraband and for suspicious actions. So Akubo in the background is spying in a meta kind of, this is meta before there was meta, is spying on the spy who's spying on people who are gambling and smoking and drinking in the room behind. So her book is full of these amazing observations and very beautiful comments, or a running narrative commentary about what is really going on. Remember that we were told that food was plentiful, and that people had plenty of room to eat, and things were really great in these relocation centers, and ultimately in the camps that were built further inland. Here she comments on the fact that the new mess halls were open and the kids had lost all of their sense of propriety and manners. And she illustrates that here. I hope you're thinking about where Minnie is as you're looking at these. This is the barracks that they were assigned, she and her brother were assigned, basically stalls in this racetrack, which they had to clean up and find straw mattresses for and fill the mattresses. And by the time they got to sleep, they were told that they should bring food, which they brought and ate in this mess, just canned stuff, and very uncomfortable, crowded sort of situation. So Akubo in this book just tells the story so beautifully and resists the narrative so beautifully. And it's this that I think is an important, what we might call counter narrative to what our government wanted us to think about this period and this action against a very large number of our fellow citizens who happen to be of Japanese descent. Please go read this book. Buy the book, read the book, study the book, think about the narrative of the book, and think about it in relation to the filmic narratives that I showed at the beginning. I hope that made some sense.
That made so much sense. Thank you so much, Kurt. I can't say it enough. And I really feel that this, hopefully you all could kind of see these through lines from thinking about these systems of seeing that were put in place even before the Japanese incarceration, even before World War II. And as we had mentioned, that Orientalism first really addressed the Middle East, but then we later see from the Americas, specifically from the United States, it becomes something different. And Saeed even noted that, it's, for Europe, the Orient means, the Middle East, but for the United States, it really does mean East Asia, specifically China and Japan. And so how it takes shape in the United States is built on a whole nother history and a whole nother set of events that occurred here, and how, those of us who do live in the United States, whether we are aware of these histories or not, we are a part of it. And it is sometimes a difficult thing to separate yourself from. And some of the things I think that we're seeing happening in the world, and specifically in our own neighborhoods, we're seeing this hashtag Stop Asian Hate, things like this. And, I think a lot of these problems we're still unfortunately experiencing stem from all of these long systems that have been in place. And this, like the text that Kurt just mentioned to us, these are some ways that we can start to try to divorce ourselves from those biases and those ways of seeing that are just truly ingrained into our every being. I actually didn't even learn about the camps in high school. That wasn't even a part of my curriculum. So yeah.
One more thing. The thing I love about Daniel Inouye's response is his, he understood this otherness, and he lived in a place where there were lots of Japanese Americans, and yet he still understood that he was seen as other, that he would be seen as other, and he was continuously seen as other, as a member of the U.S. forces, as a senator, and as a Medal of Honor winner. And it's that, I think my friends from all over, from every nation in Asia, that is the exhaustion, that it's very difficult for those of us who are not othered because of the color of our skin and our ethnicity to understand that exhaustion and that sense of, I don't even know how to say, but I think that, yeah. And I love the way you said that system of seeing It's exactly a system of seeing, and Mine Akubo destabilizes our system of seeing.
Yeah, and I think that's we'll keep talking. We're not at all close to done with our chats for the night, but I think what we're so fortunate to have in this discussion are a lot of different ways that we can see things and a lot of new perspectives, so that we can try to actively see things differently. Which I think there's no way around it. Unfortunately, we got to do that work. So. Once again, we're going to bring Kurt back at the end so we can all talk together. And all those questions you have in chat, we've definitely been keeping track of them. We've not forgotten them. We will come back to them. So we'll just politely ask Kurt if she doesn't mind waiting a little bit and returning to talk with us again.
That's fine, but am I allowed to hear Yuki's talk?
Yuki's next.
I know, but I couldn't hear the first talk.
I don't know. We were having a lot of technical difficulties.
Oh, okay.
To be honest.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'll just go away. Bye.
Kurt,
Go away. Also,
I'll email you a link to the Twitch channel and you can take a look at it there.
yes. And Kurt is, I'm going to wait for my gushing till the end. Yep. I'm going to.
Don't gush.
There's no way around it. There's no way around it.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay. Alrighty. And
Hold on one second.
Yep.
I want to give an introduction to Yuki as well.
Okay.
We've actually had Yuki on Tokyo House Party before, so you may have all seen her around our August 6th-ish episode last year, talking about nuclear discourse. But Yuki Miyamoto is an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies at DePaul University, teaching atomic bomb discourse, nuclear ethics, and environmental ethics. Her works include Beyond the Mushroom Cloud, Commemoration, Religion, and Responsibility After Hiroshima in 2012, Naze Genbaku ga akude wa nai no ka, America no Kakuishiki, 2020. So that just was published, but I understand that that's not in translated to English yet. And A World Otherwise, Environmental Praxis and Minamata just came out. We'll have to ask her about those things. But without further ado, another patron saint of mine that is just one of the most lovely people, and we're so fortunate to have her time too, Yuki Miyamoto.
alrighty.
Otherwise, Environmental Praxis and Minamata just came out. We'll have to ask her about those things. But without further ado, another patron saint of mine that is.
I will mute.
Hello, Miyamoto Sensei. You just need to mute your Twitch stream, but not your mic.
Sorry. Okay. Well, is this my turn?
It's your turn.
Okay.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you for your generous introduction, Sarah. And it's such a pleasure to work with you again and again. And usually when we work, she does the work and I take for credit, or
No.
I do, I just take for credit. So it's great. Thank you for having me. And let me share my screen here. So you can see this, right? And let me turn this into this mode. Okay, so is this okay?
Yep.
Okay,
good.
so, okay, good, thank you. What I want to talk about today is romanticized and dismissed, and especially I would like to focus on the female figures, so gender discourse. And I'm very glad that some of the Sarah's introduction to Orientalism and the images are often women, and some of them were highly eroticized, naked bodies hanging out in the bathhouse and stuff. So I would like to make some connections with it, and I'm especially a big fan of Edward Said. So it was very sad that I hear that he passed away. I was able to actually listen to his talk when he came to the U of C when I was a grad school student, and of course I fell in love, right? He was very soft-spoken guy, but very sharp mind. So I'm very honored to be on this night, Tokyo House Party, on the theme of Orientalism. So let me Oh, right. And so my talk is entitled Romanticized and Dismissed Asian Women in the Media in 1950s. But in the end, I would like to talk a little bit about in the 80s. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, as a segue to Casper's talk, a little bit of pop culture there. But first of all, this is not necessarily about Asian women, but I want to talk about representations of the atomic age, because often the representations are done through female figures or female presence was sort of politicized or even weaponized as during the Cold War in the 50s. So that's what I would like to start. And this image might be very familiar to you. This is a mushroom cloud swimsuit, but this is a kind of, this is an icon in the 50s. And that's part of the reasons why you may have come across this image. But this is a good icon to show that how the atomic age has been associated with female figures. So what's the point behind it? And before I want to talk about it, another image here, this is a mushroom cloud cake. And this is also a kind of banalization or normalization or feminization, especially this was taken in 1948 or so. So especially the time when women's work was confined to keeping houses, keeping home safe and keeping home clean and comfortable to family members. So therefore cake is also kind of feminized during this time period, yet this image is closely associated with the mushroom cloud. So again, I would call this kind of a banalization of the mushroom cloud or the nuclear weapons themselves. So bikini also, bikini was actually named after the Bikini Atoll of the Marshall Islands. And as you know, Marshall Islands was actually the US territory until 1986. So, and because of that, the US had conducted 67 nuclear tests on that atoll. But the first test was a year after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was in 1946, and it was very eye-opening. So therefore, bikini, it's such a tiny cloth on women's body. It's shocking. And so that's the association. So again, this feminization or even eroticization of the nuclear weapons was very much there immediately after the bombing, immediately after 1945. And another one is mushroom cloud hairdo. And I apologize that I don't have an image of it, but there is a short video. You may be able to find it on YouTube. A woman who came into this beauty salon and showing this mushroom cloud photo to beautician or hairdresser and asked her if she could make her hair like a mushroom cloud. So once again, this is a kind of feminization of these weapons. And how does this have to do with the Orientalism in art? And just a little bit more patience, because I want to talk a little bit about, I want to situate this issue in the 50s and put into the context. So let me talk a little bit more about this context. And in the 50s, that's the height of the Cold War, the militarization of citizens was very much normalized. And especially when we say citizens, that's aimed at a family. And the family should be patriarchal and independent and autonomous. Independent and autonomous individuals should form a home, a family, and you have to have strong mentality. So this is a kind of propaganda, what kind of ideal citizens should be, or what kind of ideal American should be, who is independent, autonomous, strong mentality, but also a family person, right? And then the family is also patriarchal structure. And for example, there is a book, Protecting the Home Front, how women were employed to carry out this, this propaganda and this militarization of citizens. And especially after the World War II, during the World War II, women were working in place of men who went, who were dispatched abroad. So they were working, but after the war, they had to give the space to, or the workspace to men who had returned from the war. So now what are they going to do? And that's the place where this propaganda worked. So for example, in order to survive the nuclear wars, you have to keep house clean. And actually keeping a house clean contributes to self-defense so that you can exit your house quickly, or the fire is not gonna break out easily. Or so those are the propaganda. But that's also giving a role to women who returned to home after WW2. So they were now proud of keeping a house in a certain way. And that's the way that was labeled, or that was packaged as a way that they are contributing to the national defense. So it's a noble task, right? So now nuclear family was based, so that's also a part of the propaganda, but also, of course, the family has to be heterosexual, right, during that time period, and wise housewife who knows science. So this is also the time when home appliance was very much permeated throughout the nation and throughout the houses, those families. And the microwave oven was also a product of the nuclear science. So that's why we say nucleate, right? So the term nuke, to use the microwave, came from directly the nuclear science. But that was considered as good and even progressive. So this is a reference for other book, Laura McKinney, Civil Defense Begins at Home. So there are many books talking about how women were employed to into this propaganda of militarizing citizens. And also, once again, let me emphasize this, this emphasis of family. Now, I would like to talk about Hiroshima Maidens. And this is a project. So here, I would like to talk about Asian Americans and Asian Asians, or Japanese. 25 women scarred from the atomic bombing. They were invited to the US for free reconstruction surgeries. So that was 1955. And they actually stayed in the United States for a little over a year. But during those times, they homestayed and they had the surgeries, because usually one surgery was not sufficient to heal their wounds. So most of the time they had to go through several surgeries. So that took them over a year stay in the United States. During that time, any expenses were covered. Not any, but I would say the accommodation was covered by staying people's homes, and the doctors donated their time to this project. And the US Army, US military, US Air Force actually provided the means to fly to the US. Although their way back to Japan, they took the commercial airplanes. This project was supported by Methodists and the Quakers. Those are the ones who hosted those Hiroshima Maidens. And this story was narrated in the 1980s. So let's take a look at the narrative, how they had been perceived or understood in the US discourse. And this is an expression of American benevolence because, we are extending our kindness to the former enemies. So this is American benevolence. And another Quaker writer would say, since there is no good Samaritan example in Japan, which refers to Bible story, no good Samaritan example in Japan, we are extending our benevolence to them. And this is a good sign of reconciliation between the US and Japan. So this is a beautiful reconciliation between the two countries who had fought very cruelly just 10 years before. So this is a kind of understanding or narrative around the Hiroshima Maidens. But then, which drastically changed in the 2000 or this century, 21st century, especially by Asian American scholars. When they looked into this project, they had a very different take in the interpretations. And let's take a look at critique against Orientalist portrayal of Hiroshima Maidens. And first of all, the naming, right? Maidens. So especially those 25 women who are single. And of course, in the 50s, in 50s, once again, in the United States and in Japan, in both countries, women's, the opportunities to give women to make living were very limited, right? So therefore, marrying is highly, highly emphasized culturally. And actually in the 50s, the birth rate in the United States was exceeding that of India. And the average age of marriage in the United States was lower than the age of 20. So that was the time period. And if you go to college, that's the place where you should find your future husband. So the degree is often ridiculed as MRS, like Mrs. So that's the time period in the 50s, and not that different from Japan as well. And in the 50s, and especially those women who had suffered from external injuries. So of course they were they found it difficult to find their partners. And it's not just the injuries, but other discriminatory gazes and treatment against them, which I'm hoping I can touch upon if we have time. And so moving on, so critique Orientalist portrayal. And those, let me go a little bit farther. So these are the references, and these references here, Christina Klein, and all of them are Asian American scholars. And summing what they were saying is that this project is not about benevolence. This project is not about the horror of the nuclear scars, but rather reconstruction of post-war American morals, which is white, suburban nuclear family, which is patriarchal and middle class based on heterosexual relationship and the Judeo-Christian morals. So this is a kind of ideal in the 50s, and the Hiroshima Maidens was used to spread this ideology. So that's their take. But they were also posing a question: if this is really about reconciliation, why didn't media? I'm not degrading individuals' good intentions trying to help those Hiroshima Maidens, but unfortunately, media portrayal was, as I talked about, reconstruction of post-war American identity. So then those scholars were posing a question. So if this was really reconstruction or reconciliation between the United States and Japan, or reconciliation of the war, then why didn't media mention Japanese Americans who helped the Maidens? And actually there are many Japanese Americans and in that community helped the Hiroshima Maidens, or they some of them served as an interpreter, and some of them held the parties and dinner parties, dance parties, so that Hiroshima Maidens wouldn't feel homesick terribly. And one of them is actually, you might have heard of Yuri Kochiyama. And this is a very famous image when Malcolm X was shot. And you might have come across this picture. But do you know who this is? This is Mary Kochiyama, later known as Yuri Kochiyama, and she was born in California. She was the second generation of the migrant families. But during the war, she was forced to relocate herself. Well, before that, her father was arrested for the espionage. But that's actually not true, and he was released, but then passed away not long after. And after the family lost the father, who was to some extent very successful as a businessman in California, they had to relocate themselves to St. Jerome, I want to say, in Arkansas. Right, there is another camp relocation place there. So that's where she was during the wartime. And if this is about reconciliation, then they also should be highlighted. But of course, she was totally dismissed, as well as other Japanese Americans who helped with this project. Instead, I was talking about earlier, like people who have these kind of attributes tend to have more spotlights. So getting back to this, and it was actually Yuri Kochiyama who introduced those hibakusha women, hibakusha meaning sufferers of the atomic bombings, those hibakusha women to Malcolm X. Malcolm X was able to see those women or other hibakusha through Miss Kochiyama. So yeah, that's a little arrow. But I'm not saying that this kind of romanticization, not romanticization, but rather dismissal of a certain population and using them as the national propaganda is unfortunately common. So let me talk about Japan, how Japan used those hibakusha women for their political use. And what happened was, even earlier than this Hiroshima Maidens project, some women from Hiroshima were invited to Tokyo for reconstruction surgeries and then scheduled to, not knowing anything, that they were brought to Sugamo prison, which is a place where those war prisoners were interned. And there, those women met Mr. Kaya and Mr. Hata, and they were high-ranking officers at the time of the war. So they were interned, they were brought into the Sugamo prison. And this was also through media broadcasted as the reconciliation between the victims of the bombings and the victimizers of promoting the war efforts. But this was not those women's intention. So this was definitely kind of created, especially the time in 1952. That's the year that Japan became independent. So those occupied forces, or SCAP, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, were leaving. So there was a big movement that we should pardon those prisoners at Sugamo prison. So sort of the reactions to the loss of war, and they were trying to sort of forget or exonerate those prisoners from the war crimes. And those injured women were used for that purpose. So dismissed and discriminated. And 1950s and 60s, dismissed and discriminated. Those sufferers were very much discriminated. And then there are a couple of episodes I want to talk about. Let me see how much I have time. But you can read there. a male college student was evicted from a boarding house in Tokyo when the owner learned that his older brother had been hospitalized in the atomic bomb hospital in Hiroshima. So this association that, oh, your brother was a sufferer of the bombing and hospitalized. You can't be here. You can't live here. So that's a kind of discrimination, which was, this is just a one episode, but the similar episodes are everywhere. And Domon Ken, which is a renowned photographer who also took this photo and many other photos about Hiroshima and actually published the photo books, one out in 1958 and other in 1978. He's very renowned, nationally and internationally renowned photographer. But some people testified that he never shook hands with the sufferers, never even touched their beds. So this is, again, discriminated against by the fellow citizens in Japan. And of course, there are many other different kinds of discriminatory treatments, such as at the time of employment, because of their fragile health, they were it was harder to get a job. Reproductivity was cast doubt, so they were women are often blamed when they couldn't have children, or the children were born with some kind of congenital diseases, illnesses. And from there, that culminated in, I'm forwarding a little bit in time here, that was culminated in the 70s, actually in 1976 at the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly. This member, Kondo, who is also a medical doctor, proposed a bill to sterilize the survivors of the bombing. This, of course, didn't pass, but that was still going, that kind of discussion was still going on in the 70s, 30 years after the bombing. So this kind of discrimination was taking place against the sufferers, and especially women. And how does this have to do with the big theme? Oops, I didn't mean to. What do you see? Do you see my face?
It's all four of us, yeah.
Oh, do you still see the slides? No?
No,
okay.
no.
Okay, let me get back to the slides. I must have too excited and then clicking whatever, right? Okay, good. So the reason is that even though in reality they were severely discriminated against, right, to the extent that this sterilization was discussed, but at the same time, their stories were highly romanticized. And this theme is something I've been bothered and I've been thinking of. And it would be great if we could talk about this, because this romanticization of illness has a long history, right? For example, Susan Sontag talks about illness as metaphor and how tuberculosis has been romanticized since the turn of the centuries. So there is a long history of romanticizing illness, especially women's illness. And those women are usually suffering in silence, and especially in the atomic bomb discourse, they are usually suffering in silence, and yet they are beautiful inside and out. And tuberculosis was like that, right? Tuberculosis, you get pale, but you get also, because of the fever, you have rosy cheek and rosy lips. And so you are actually beautiful outside, as well as you are suffering in silence. So you're virtuous. And that's very similar when it comes to the atomic bomb narratives, which is usually, instead of tuberculosis, the common illness, common disease is leukemia. And they are usually died prematurely. And prematurely means unmarried and unmothered. And because of the societal norms emphasizes marriage and having kids, it's even more tragic if you die before marrying, before being a mother. So that kind of narrative plot or even trope is very common to tuberculosis and leukemia from the atomic bombing. And I was going to talk about something else here, but I'm going to skip this Le Pensée Sauvage. But the point is this, on the one hand, in reality, people are so discriminated, and especially those women who are discriminated. But on the other hand, highly romanticized. And this is the theme which I would like to tie in with Orientalism and how romanticized women's bodies are, of course, objectified and eroticized, but also that there is some kind of romanticization which is detached from and severely divorced from the reality. So that's something I would like to discuss. And so I'm a little bit forwarding. This is in 1980s. There are two movies came out from about the atomic bomb sufferers. And one is A Black Rain, came out 1998. And this is the scene that the protagonist found that her hair, she's losing the hair. And that's one of the common symptoms of radiation illness. But then this picture doesn't show well, but she actually found this when she was taking a bath. So it's like, why, she's back naked. And like, why does she have to find this tragic reality when she's back naked? And so this is a kind of the combination of eroticization, romanticization of illness, and which is again totally divorced from the reality. And the same as Yumechiyo Nikki, which is roughly translated as the Diary of Yumechiyo, which was a very popular series, TV series, and later made into a movie. And the protagonist is a geisha and a sufferer, the atomic bomb sufferer in utero, and suffering from leukemia. So she is destined to die prematurely. So again, unmarried and unmothered. So it's very tragic. So once again, this is a highly romanticized. I mean, like geisha itself is so orientalistic notion, yet this on top of that, this romanticization of illness. So I'm totally puzzled by this dichotomized image, or it's not even image, the reality. And but there are some scholars talking about romantic racism, right? Somehow racism is romanticized. So romanticize the victimization or victims. We understand romanticizing the victimizer, right? And that's the way to justify their brutal actions. But there is also romanticization of the victimhood, and that's romanticization of fetishization. And I think there is what they have in common is kind of Orientalism here, especially when it comes to the representation of the atomic bomb victims. So dismissed and disregarded and degraded, meaning those other populations who don't match this idealistic victim image, they were usually dismissed, disregarded, and degraded. Like Yuri Kochiyama, she is a Japanese American, but she speaks English. Of course, she's American, and she serves as an interpreter, and she speaks out. She was working with Malcolm X. So she doesn't fit the Orientalistic ideology or idea of East Asian women. So she was often dismissed. And lately, I was looking into Char's book because she was also, I think, kind of falling into this category of dismissed, disregarded, and degraded. She's an artist, avant-garde artist. And I was reading this Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and that's how I got to know Miss Cha. So I think that's a good representation. And lastly, I'm trying to end this presentation with a little lighter note, and I'm hoping that this is a nice segue to Caspar's presentation, or we will see. But I want to talk about this movie, The Mysterians, which came out 57. And as you know, the Godzilla came out 54, but the American rendition came 2 years after, so 1956. But this Mysterians, the same people gathered to make the same meaning, the people who made Godzilla gathered again to make this Mysterians, which is in Japanese, Chikyu Boegum, which was translated into English, brought into the United States under the name of the Mysterians. And the reason why I'm talking about this is the plot, how women were represented in this story. The story is the Mysterians planet. They were what's the word? Like aliens.
Extraterrestrial.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, I'm not even trying to say it again. But yes, aliens. So they came from their planet because their planet was contaminated with radiation from nuclear tests. They did a lot of nuclear tests. And then this was the time, actually, late 50s. Many nuclear countries were, especially the United States, were conducting the nuclear tests so many times. And actually citizens started worried about their health, and they started collecting the kids' teeth, because when they see the kids' teeth, they can detect the strontium-90, which doesn't exist in the natural world, only exists from the nuclear explosion. So they collected it, and then they actually found much later. So the collection started around this time period, which led to the nuclear test ban treaty later. But during this time, the citizens' anxieties about their health concerns from radiation was increasing. And so this actually matched their anxieties. So the story is this, and as a result, those Mysterians do not have healthy residents or healthy offsprings. And that's their concern. They need kids to carry on this planet. And their solution is that to go to the earth. And we are not asking much. We want this little land, which is very modest request coming from the other planet, like really small place. But their request, which was outrageous, was, and we want healthy women, and we want their blood. The reason is we want to transfuse their blood into the male Mysterians so that they became they regain health. This is probably outrageous now, but during that period, no one really called into question how women are treated. Women were considered as kind of expendable, and no one is concerned about women's health. Even Mysterians females were not a question of concerns. So that might be an interesting point to think about, this representation and otherness is what Kurt was talking about, how the other is represented in media and in art, or lack thereof. So there's no representations. So that's the end of my talk. And I am looking forward to having more conversations. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Yuki. I feel like I almost felt like I was in one of your classes again just for a minute, and it's very natsukashi. It's so nice. Let me text Kurt really quickly to let her know that we're back.
Should be able to permit her to enter once again. I just briefly placed her in the waiting room.
She asked for a text because she couldn't figure out Twitch. All of that said, I feel like there must be a lot of questions out there. And so we're almost to a question place. But leading into this, Casper and Derek, I wonder if you have some thoughts that kind of take us on this trajectory from the late 1700s into World War II and into the post-war period. So now we're talking about ASEN. We're talking about, the theme of our show was to really bring some of these topics into ASEN viewers' worlds. So I feel like you all are so well equipped to bridge us to this, and I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah. Real quick, do you want me to let Kurt in now during this portion of our conversation as well?
Maybe because she can't hear.
Okay.
Because she hasn't been able to watch. So
just
it might
wanted to be
helpful.
sure. He should be.
So I think the way that this the fan service portion of this conversation, where the origin was, right, was where we were planning this programming for ASEN, and the ASEN theme was food in anime, right?
Mhm.
And I think that Sarah, you were the first, or you were catching up on Food Wars. And you had a very distinct experience while watching that. I think Derek and I have seen at least some of it before, but when we all came together, you had a visceral reaction, right?
Yep.
Yes. And
Yeah.
in chat, have you all seen Food Wars? I'm gonna make some leaps that it's so popular. Maybe some of you have seen Food Wars.
Can I chime in here? Because I'm teaching actually this quarter religion and ethics in Japanese foodscapes. And so we were showing this great documentary by director Aya Hanabusa, Tale of a Butcher Shop. So it's a small butcher shop in Osaka, raising a cow, and
Oh yes.
yeah, of course, I have to show slaughter and masculine, right? Because the other day I was showing the cove. So like, I'm just, yeah.
Well, Yuki, this is a very different take on food from all of the things you've just explained. My response, and I feel like I owe everyone a little explanation there, and that I dabble in anime, dabble here and there. So I think some of the tropes and some of the things that are commonplace for others, I found really jarring. And so, this anime about it's like an Iron Chef meets softcore porn, something like this. So, they're cooking, but it's just lots of
that's a great
shots of underwear and boobs, a lot of boobs. And I was just thinking, like, how is this even about cooking? And then I learned from one of my old interns that this is called fan service. And I'm like, fan service? What does this mean? Like, there's a term for this gratuitous, like, the plot doesn't matter. We can just show all of this hypersexualization of women in this way. Although, to be fair, in that show, there is some of men as well. But yeah, this was my response and my feedback.
So I think that was the origin of the conversation. So then we decided, like, what is fan service? And we were trying to, just chat about that on our own. And I mean, if we look at a definition, right, it is fan services. It is something that is put into a series that is directly for the fans to react to, and often in a sexual manner or in a fetishization, which doesn't particularly mean sexual fetishization. It could mean technological, with the foods as well. Like, the way that those are presented are another way to, to get a really, like a strong reaction from someone, whether it be something that is titillating, or something that is like, I really want to go eat that, right? So fan service is not something that's just in anime and manga. It's not just something that occurs in Japan as well. So there's many different versions of that, but I think that's where the origin of why we feel we should talk about this as part of the ASEN panel, as co-programming. And I think it's if we don't just go back to the 1700s, if we go back to 1 month ago and we had the Magical Girls episode, having that talking about Orientalism, I think it's and then fan service, like there's a common theme between the three that I haven't been able to put those dots together, but I feel that it's there.
Yeah, and I think that's totally it. And all of these, and I think what's interesting about fan service and some of the other things I'm sure you all have thoughts on, but that we are taking media from another place and without a lot of context sometimes, and just consuming, and not really thinking about the systems that are at stake underneath of that, or the kinds of implications that are there, because it seems so innocent because it's anime, it's fun, and so these were my questions. But Derek, what's your take on fan service?
It's similar to Casper in kind of zooming out. I would probably define fan service as something that is, borrowing from the name itself, in service of the audience and trying to elicit some sort of reaction out of them. And so, if you were in a comic book setting, it's finally seeing, let's say Spider-Man put on the mask, or to do his iconic, like, I'm going to hold two large splitting objects together with spider webs. These are like certain circumstances that the creators of the content are anticipating the fans are going to want out of the content that they're going into, rather that having been formally popularized in some other form of media. And so maybe it's iconic moments within, using Spider-Man again as an example, an iconic moment within a comic book that has been regarded as some sort of intense moment that needs to be portrayed in cinema. I think when placing that in the frame of Japanese media, that's talking about fan service in the way of collecting a pretty big bag of another terminology, tropes, or like specific circumstances under the umbrella of fan service that is again designed to elicit a certain interaction or a certain reaction out of the audience. And so when we go and talk about something like Food Wars or any other show that when you zoom out and think about the show as a whole, you can very plainly see it as a vehicle for providing this sort of hypersexualized or borderline pornographic material to an audience, while navigating many loopholes to get it in more accessible media forms, rather than say if it were explicitly directly defined as being like hentai or something like that.
Well, I think it's interesting too, because even going back to some of the things that Kurt had mentioned in terms of the language that's used to talk about things to distance yourself from the actual events or actions that are happening, and incarceration versus internments, or relocation versus being dragged away from your home. They're very choice words, but they feel better to hear them rather than what it is. I mean, I think you could even say things like, we're talking about beef means cow, it's cow. But so similar to the kind of language that's used to distance ourselves from some of these difficult or maybe questionable behaviors. And this is just me throwing it out here. I'm trying not to make any judgments, but similar to what Kurt had mentioned in the internment camps and some of how important language is and what language is used to talk about the things that we partake in. I wonder if calling things like fan service is distancing from what we're actually doing, and if there is just a question, if there is something problematic about it.
Yeah. One of the things that I think I had commented to you both earlier about prior to the show was, being an adult and participating in watching anime is a much different experience than, when you've grown up in the medium. And I would say growing up in the medium as like anime being introduced in the United States by, popular channels like Toonami and underneath Cartoon Network, and that being extended to other television channels, and growing up in the 80s and 90s and catching anime on cable television before being able to articulate that it was derived from it was Japanese media, and understanding it as being different than Batman, or the cartoons that you saw on another television station. growing up in that time period and being introduced to shows that do place these sort of themes, this fetishization, and kind of softening the terminologies, makes an extreme normalization of those tropes and context, like existing specifically within that medium, and making it okay in a lot of different circumstances for many years, and that continues into talking about contemporary anime now. I try to express this in a way that doesn't that I don't want to get too passionate about it, because it does make me a little heated in a way when I think about how much content I have consumed as a kid and as an adult, and then slowly, by way of my own study or tangential academic environments, having the veil lifted a little bit more and more to be able to articulate and understand the type of content that we are consuming and the type of tropes that are being placed in front of us as if those things are okay. And it makes it very difficult to want to consume new forms of anime or contemporary stories if those same themes are going to be perpetuated. And so I can think back to an older anime series. I can think back to a newer one, and a lot of them are going to have a lot of parallels with yes, this hypersexualization of women, this fetishization of their bodies, their plight or ability or non-ability to do something, and in some capacity, some sort of harem narrative. I think the only change that we might be seeing in, this is purely conjecture on my part, but I would say a piece of change that we might be seeing in this is maybe instead of confronting that conversation and putting it on its head, we might be seeing like the reverse happen. Where it's saying, okay, well, traditionally we've seen this story happen at the disadvantage of women traditionally, and so we're going to do that, but we're going to flip it for the sake of flipping it and do the exact same tropes, except we'll do this to men instead. And it's a very unique. It doesn't necessarily solve the issue. It doesn't necessarily say that the previous perpetuation of these themes was wrong. It just says, no, we're just doing this to be fun and original. So yeah, there's a few thoughts there.
Yeah, I was thinking of that at a different angle, where if we say that we're going to do it, it's okay that we do it. Or if it's sort of implied that this is going to be, kind of an overly sexualized piece of work, is it okay for that to occur as long as you know where that is going into it? And then at that point, whereas when you're defining what that work is and you're defining what your audience is going to be, is it just recently seeing the new Demon Slayer anime, right? I think the question that Sarah, you asked is is it a shonen, right? Is it for young boys? I initially thought in my head, yes. But then when you go back and you kind of pick apart a lot of what's going on there, it kind of changed my opinion a little bit. So I think that's my most immediate sort of reaction there, is I knew going into Demon Slayer what the level of violence that it was going to be, but then I also go into it thinking that it's going to be a fun anime as well. So
yeah, that's why I asked you. I was like, is this a shonen? I kind of don't know. There's a lot of guts here. Is this really teenage boys are okay for this? Okay,
whole lot of guts. A lot of guts.
But yeah, no, I think, and this is such a great question, and I definitely don't have the answer. And the other thing I really wanted to kind of firmly state is that I don't think anyone is without this system in their system. How about myself included? None of us are exempt from it. And in no way do I want to, give the image that I feel like I'm able to see through it at every turn. That is not at all where I stand in this world either. It's a matter of, actively, critically thinking about everything that you're ingesting, and it's not easy. And I think I don't know if there's any age difference in the way education has been perpetuated, but when I was in school, in grade school, the mode of learning was you sit and you listen, you sit and you listen, you sit and you take it in. and there's no room for questions. It's not like, so where did that information come from? But I do get the impression from some of my later experiences with CPS teachers in K through 12 classrooms that questioning dispositions are rewarded, and sharing multiple sources are important to teachers, and asking lots of questions are at the core of teaching and learning. So, and I think those are the kinds of things that we call them 21st century skills, but that you now need, that you didn't necessarily know you needed when you were younger, because you get all of this onslaught of information all the time. And, what's at stake as you're watching it? There's fireworks outside, and and what do you do about it? And I think that's the question I generally don't have the answer to either. Like, not that you stop enjoying, these forms of media, but what's the responsible way that you treat it?
Responsible way is a really, that's like the key term that's in my head. Obviously I'm not, I too am not an expert at seeing through the veil, and I'm saying that I've completely abandoned watching anime because I can't personally reconcile dealing with the tropes or something like that. I think that goes along with being a black man in this country, and watching other forms of media that might portray people that look like me in other mannerisms. So I think we're constantly engaging with media that presents narratives where we may not at first recognize is that a topic that is a bit more pernicious than originally thought. And I think because we're on the subject of anime at this point, that is a medium where a lot of those themes have entered into the space, and it does ask the viewer and asks future creators to challenge themselves to examine the content that they as the next generation of creators or story writers ask themselves to examine that content, and in some ways make sure or try to ensure that they're not perpetuating any of those circumstances just because maybe they were initially inspired and there was a certain scene within an anime that stood out to them, or it might be regarded as iconic, but not first asking themselves if that why or where does that extend to.
Yeah. And, I think it's interesting too, because this was something that the ASIN team brought up to me when I pitched us doing this topic. And I wonder if Yuki could speak to it a little bit, but that how these topics and these tropes and these acceptable streams of media are made in Japan, and by whom and for whom. And, there's a pushback of, well, if Japan is okay with it, why can't we be okay with it? So I wonder what you would think about that, Yuki.
Oh, thank you. Of course, my thought is always brought back to the atomic bomb discourse, if that's okay. But I think what you were saying earlier about the language, which helps me to think about this romanticization, which was totally divorced from the reality, which is the same as Orientalism, right? This representation, visual representation, is so romanticized, but then in reality, how they were treated is very different, and which we just experienced a couple of months ago in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. Right, what happened was this romanticization, but also the like brutal killings, and so that's what I was thinking of. But in Japan, I guess this romanticization of victimization is, again, as Sarah was talking about earlier, and Kart's representation clarifies to us that it's easier to consume. So this is the fan services for commercialization, right? And what sells is justice, I guess, in this late capitalist society. So in that sense, that the majority who doesn't want to talk about, or who doesn't want to see how they are a part of victimizers, they would really like to see nice stories. And I'm so moved by their struggles, and that's a very easy way to consume, and which was in this capitalist society rewarded. consuming the stories. And so I guess it's yeah, I think it's all related. It's politicization, but also capitalized on people's tragedy.
So I'm kind of reminded of a situation that's going on right now that, for me, it's kind of personal. I'm working on some sci-fi fantasy novels. And what I've found recently is that certain publishing houses, they don't want, they don't want fantasy that's like classic Anglo-Saxon, like sort of fantasy that takes place in Europe, right? So immediately my head thinks, should this be taking place in, in Japan, in China, and if it does, like, am I in a position to write that, here domestically in the United States? And something that has also, I think it happened a couple of years ago, but one of the Marvel editors-in-chief, or the current Marvel editor-in-chief, I believe, it took a pen name, a Japanese pen name, and started writing the manga version of certain Marvel characters. And then he was eventually outed, right, as a Caucasian man, under a Japanese pen name.
What?
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
That happened roughly, I think he started writing about 2003, and then in the later 2000s that came out, where to differentiate himself from other writers, and to kind of lean into what the market that Marvel was kind of going for, which is a manga market. He took that name. So I'm personally struggling with the idea of turning a fantasy novel into one that exists in the time of shogun and samurai. But am I then doing Orientalism in a way, right? Or
Ooh.
not.
Yeah.
But Derek, yeah, your words of when creators are being being cognizant of the type of media that they want to create, that struck a note in the back of my head, and then did my Wikipedia on my second screen here to find the other example.
Yeah, that is it can be hard, depending on the circumstance too, I guess. Ask where a situation might fall within appreciation or appropriation. I want to use an example of my own, and that's with the game Onsen Master, and this is a game that Waking Oni Studios has created, and it is placing it is placed within a fantasy Japanese narrative. Now there are a lot of reasons for all of this, and it even goes into the studio name. The reason that I personally, I've been asking myself a similar question, like, do I have the me doing this? Am I adding to, or am I taking away from? Am I taking away space, essentially? But the purpose of creating Onsen Master was to examine cultural intersections, specifically Black and Japanese cultural intersections, because my experience with anime has always been trying to examine where representations have been created within the space, and that's like representations of Black characters, representations of other BIPOC characters within anime, and the depictions of them from a studio that does not traditionally include those individuals behind the pencil or at the drawing board. What I found most interesting about that, even taking one step further, is the inclusion of hip hop or Black culture within certain anime. And so to use Samurai Champloo and even Cowboy Bebop with the inclusion of jazz, and these are both iconic series created by Watanabe, who is nowadays doing plenty of collaborations with Black individuals and including them in the musicality of a lot of these shows, like Flying Lotus, for example, and these certain intersections that this cultural exchange had continued to happen on Toonami. Black individuals consuming anime, creating interpretations, Japanese individuals borrowing from Black culture and using that music. And when asking, when creating own semester, I continued to battle that same question with myself and wanting to ensure that the content that I'm creating is not taking away space from somebody else. And I think the most important thing, that's one of the biggest questions that you can ask at the core, and I think it helps to answer whether or not you should pursue it. The other part is like doing the work. If that's something that you're deliberate to create, then maybe it's seeking routes to collaborate with people who are a part of that space that can intricately speak to some of the experiences that you might inadvertently highlight in the content that you would be generating. But I think that would be kind of like the answer to that, at least in my opinion.
And Guy C847 in the chat has I think it's going to be one of our favorite kind of low-hanging fruit, but it's The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. It's like almost like the epitome, the Western epitome of or the Western modern epitome of taking that space away. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what's interesting too is and I know we needed more time to really unpack Orientalism because it's just such a topic, and I apologize for my hurried mix through it, but really what at its core is that there's someone who wants something from someone else, right? Someone is looking for resources, positional power, land, whatever that might be, and it's not just being in a position of power to have it, but it's also being in a position to create sources of media around it that give it legs to stand on. So in thinking about the very traditional sense that Edward Said was talking about, and then also what Kurt talked about, and that we have government films, we have documentary photos, we have all kinds of reasons you can build around an action so that people think it's true and it's real, because why would you question those things? And so it's more than just a film or some kind of move and an action. It's bolstered by all these really powerful things that you need a lot to put in place. And Kurt, I feel like you'd love to add, so I'd love to hear you add.
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
I don't really know why I'm here, but because I don't think my presentation really fit into the conversation, but I'm sorry.
No,
maybe I misunderstood the assignment.
No, you didn't know.
But I do think it's even getting more dangerous because it's always been possible to alter paintings that happened in China during the communist period and the Cultural Revolution in particular, take people out and put people in. It's always been possible to do that, but it's so much easier to do it now. And I think with these social media makes it so tempting to, or I mean, it makes it easy to make a false image go viral, and so that is dangerous. And then just the whole language, people are so much less careful about language on social media. And I mean, even I just made a big mistake this weekend and had to mute a whole conversation. I just asked a question and it got like unbelievable amount of backlash. A very simple question. So I mean, I think there's so much room for misunderstanding because everything is so fast and we're not thinking critically about what we're saying. And this whole idea of fan service is perplexing and
and the way I think it's interesting and really does in fact build on your resources you brought to us, Kurt, is that just like this world building that happens in internment, that happens in colonization, that happens in imperialistic aspirations, and this is a heavy lift, I'm sorry, but I'm putting it down. But the world of anime and people who love anime, there is a whole world built there, and there's a whole system built there for loving it. And I mean, not just dabbling and liking it and watching one or two, but like in over your head loving it. And so some of the content that you're taking in then really takes on a whole new level of importance. And the thing about Saeed and his critique on academia is, you know, these are your peers that are writing all these things and establishing these facts for you. And I think what's interesting about academia is that, you know, we count on them for being true as well, that, oh, they're peer reviewed, which means that people from their field also read them and agreed with it. But I still feel like there's some discontent in that. And so if we're only still talking within our own groups and circles about what meaning is to be made by fan service or anime, or how we understand Asian Americans, the United States, you'll still come up with the same answers and just rebolster those things.
Well, to me, academia is about whose stories get told.
Yes.
And gatekeeping, and the whole tenure process, of which some 50% of people teaching in universities are not tenured or not tenurable. So that's a kind of gatekeeping, and it disallowed. And really, everybody is putting forth a perspective. There is no real truth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have to think about what the truth that's being told is. I mean, maybe even Mine Akubo's truth wasn't the real truth, but it was her truth.
Mm-hmm.
And we should at least put it into our consideration. And it's about allowing a broader spectrum of stories to be told. And I don't know, in terms of appropriation of a particular culture for a fantasy sci-fi novel, or are you know, the question is, do you have the expertise to put it in that place? I don't even know if people who've studied China and Japan for their whole lives, who are not brought up in the culture, have the knowledge to put something in another culture. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Hence my thought to tread lightly and listen more than try to do.
It does seem, my students tell me, and I don't know very much about games and such. I have a lot of students in game design, and they tell me that there are all sorts of, that games are mostly populated by characters from Japan and Japanese history and culture.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I know Derek can speak to that.
Speak on that one. Yeah, that's absolutely this space that I work within, for the day in and day out, the 9 to 5 and so on. And this in part with having this discussion. So paired with this discussion of talking about anime tropes and things like that, and growing up within the space and criticizing it as an adult, I've been taking that, and you know, you kind of you lift the veil in that conversation. You go, well, what other things have I been interacting with or consuming or playing that are tangential to this conversation? And I want to pantomime a scene of me maybe ripping down all the books and games off my shelves, looking at anything to see, was this a bad game? and kind of comedically asking myself that question. But really, it kind of taking a look at a lot of the other games that have released, and what studios they come from as far as the content that is being delivered. And I think, in part with another conversation that we've kind of touched on, there's a game, Cyberpunk 2077. There are other games like it that continue to bring in this merriment of high fantasy, cyberpunk, technological advancements, but they're always at the accompaniment of some sort of monolithic Japanese or Chinese or Korean company in some sort of sense, and bringing this political and corporate conversation into the space of games, but always making it very commercialized and very oh, you can't have technology without China or Japan sort of centric narrative, and in a sense creating it by then creates media that people will create their own works that are inspired by the content that they played, because the content exists and it's out there. They think that because it exists, that makes it okay to make more things that are derived from it. And so, now you might have further commercialization of these sort of thoughts and themes, taking the form of products on the shelves as, very tech fancy clothes that include Japanese language on them for the sake of Japanese language being there, but the clothing or clothing production line is not Japanese or anything like that as well, and using Japanese language as like cool text to place on things. Again, another sort of commercialization of that sort of result. I am in part kind of losing a train of thought, but it happens there too. It happens within games, and it's because the games are cool and that they're flashy and they're marketed largely to children, teens, and then adults. Teens and adults making up the larger percentage of consumers, that because it's out there and because you experienced it and nothing bad happened in your experience, it makes the feeling of the content that you played as though it were allowed. But on the flip side, there are other studios that I would ask whether or not they did the work to create the content and create the content in a way that it is not taking away or not eating up space or taking away space in a way that isn't meaningful or disheartening. Excuse me. An example of that would be Sucker Punch's Ghost of Tsushima, which, while that studio is not based in Japan, did everything to honor a sort of historic point in history, creating their own narrative, but going even further to cast all Japanese voice actors for the most prominent roles within the story. But then I end up asking myself, like, well, who benefits from that that content ultimately? And that's Sucker Punch. So yeah.
And I think I'd like to call out too, there's a really lovely exchange happening in chat, so I would like to acknowledge them. But Tuned Low and Guy C847 have been kind of chatting along with us in their own dialogue too. But
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I really think that this is important and will kind of help us move into a final phase of our conversation. But this is a dialogue, even for the sake of questioning it, for the perspective is not always well tolerated, the concept of the third man woman. But this questioning disposition and how important that is, I think, to summarize this, including when considering Orientalism appropriation. So, and from Dr. Hansman's talk, we can see that not questioning can be really dangerous. And I think that that's really the core of what we're all talking about from any of these moments in history, even to this present one. So, these are things that can happen when people aren't asking questions, things that can happen when you can just take things at face value. That individual in Atlanta, their response was, well, they couldn't help themselves. Of course you can, and if that's a desire that you have, maybe start questioning that desire. Where does that come from? Those are the questions we should be asking ourselves. I don't believe he's the first or last man out there to have a fetish about Asian women. So, where do those come from? Well, why is this happening? And I think a lot of the things that we've spoken of so far are a piece of that puzzle, but certainly not the whole thing. And how we continue to, take in media and consume things that are thrown our way is part of it. And that questioning disposition is so important. But I wonder if everyone here wouldn't mind giving their 2 cents on what they feel would be an idea about moving forward from this pickle?
Question everything.
I agree. I didn't want to I didn't want to speak first, but I 100% agree that I think it's important. I think it's very important. You know, to question everything, and it sounds really broad to say do the work, but it's that is at the core, you know, of those motivations.
Yeah, similarly for me, my two words are consume thoughtfully.
I like that one.
Yuki, what say you?
Yeah, you know, I agree. I think Sarah nicely summarized what we've been talking about, and I think that's so true. And I happen to explore narratives and, you know, the dominant narratives and how it has been formed and what it is hiding. And that goes back to the language issues that Kurt and Sarah were pointing out. And also I also want to add on to something like this might be a little bit irrelevant, but you know, Caspar was asking about, like, for a while we were talking about cultural appropriation, the issue of cultural appropriation, which is always, you know, nowadays we are discussing, is this appropriation or appreciation? And I think the line is very thin, but at the same time, you know, coming from Japan, I also wonder if culture should belong to one nation. You know, like, it's because I'm from Japan, I wouldn't claim Japanese culture, or who can claim that culture? So I, not that I have the answer, or not that I, maybe this goes back to what Sarah was talking about, you know, maybe I keep questioning those issues. But thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I think even in the pursuit of those questions, that it's important to be able to observe what I, especially with the content that I create as well. I talk about a lot exploring cultural intersections, because there isn't any culture out there that would necessarily be 100% excluded from any other influence by way of the products that they have, the fashion, the clothing, the influence that is traded between social media or trade or consumerism, etc. And there's a lot of exchange between Japan, the U.S., and many other countries mutually. And so, yeah, the culture doesn't necessarily become just any one person's thing. There are, of course, like hard lines where you can say, I can see where this is derived from. But I think as long as people are asking that question and observing the intersection, I think that certainly helps to do the work.
I feel like, Kurt, you should jump in here as the woman who taught my Buddhist art classes, so we can
I was
see.
just going to say Buddhism is a primary example of this, because Buddhism originates in Nepal, becomes Indian, becomes Central Asian, is transformed in China, and then appropriated by Japan for very un-Buddhist reasons of power and authority, and then reconfigured into something completely different. You read the Nihon Shoki, and the reasons that Buddhism was being imported are so, like, about things that are totally not Buddhist. So my students are just talking about that today or last week. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard to say who owns culture, but I do think that people get to say, well, please don't use my culture in a disrespectful and improper way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's a really hard question. Isn't it getting too late for this heavy conversation?
No, it's Saturday night. We just need drinks. That's all we're missing, really.
One of the things that I would love to, I think I would kind of reminding myself of what Casper has said. I believe he said consume consciously. And I think that is a really great thought to to impart with the audience, especially relating to anybody who is, watching anime, coming from the ASIN audience, and thinking about those things, especially if, this coming Friday or Saturday, there's a new episode of something on Crunchyroll. I wonder if it will challenge any of us to be able to ask those kinds of questions when we are watching something new, and allow you to engage with that content in a slightly different perspective. We're not asking you to abandon anime and say, F it, it's all messed up or something like that, because everything has questions. Everything deserves to be asked. And,
Everything's messed up.
yeah, and some of my favorite things, Star Wars, I criticize all the time for so many different things. So I think it's important to be able to criticize things that you love.
Absolutely. And Tuned Low added something that I would love to build upon here. Their response was people in chat have been summing up what their advice would be. So theirs was to reach out to others, even if they have contrasting ideas, especially if the views don't align with yours, listening actively, because a comprehensive view shouldn't necessarily be homogeneous. And I think that when I wrote this program at the museum, at the Art Institute, called Art Plus History. And the idea is there's no single source that's enough for anything. And for every single thing they do in classrooms, they need 5 sources. You need 5 different types of sources. And then you can just build an idea that isn't even the facts or the truth yet. But without, like, let's say you want to learn about Japanese internment, we'll go there. So Kurt gave you like 4 different sources, right? The comic book is one, the documentary from the government is another, the testimony from the Pearl Harbor individual. These are all different sources, but then after you hear a few different perspectives, then you can synthesize those and have a place to stand on. But just the single one reading something like, oh, that must be it, I think that's where you get in the most trouble. And I think what you're talking about, Derek, is like, yeah, man, it's work. It's so much work. But that's what it is.
Yeah. Hopefully the passion for the content will drive you through that work and hopefully incite more work. I think my favorite part is the discoverability.
Yeah. Also, making sure everyone knows what a primary source is. How can you tell if this is a primary source or not? But yes.
7 sources if you'd wanted me to. There are at least 7 to 10 different categories of primary sources for the.
Oh, Kurt, would you list those for everyone? I feel like that's very helpful.
There are photographs that are taken by Europeans who visit the incarceration.
Mhm.
There are photographs taken by people who smuggled cameras into the Japanese Americans who smuggled cameras into the incarceration. There are the works of painters who were Japanese Americans who taught and worked in the context of the incarceration. There are diaries. There's a whole legal history of case law about the incarceration. There is all the government documents. It's a very complicated area to reconstruct. And it's not even my real primary area of investigation.
Mhm.
But anyway.
But I think that if you were to investigate all those things, someone would have a pretty good idea, right? I mean,
find out that it's not as simple, that nothing is ever as simple as it really seems on the surface, which Yuki has already said in her very amazing talk too. I need to leave, so I will say farewell.
Thank you so much, Kurt. You are a jewel. DePaul has you at all. Thank you so much.
We'll hope to see everyone at some other point.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, and I will say that Dr. Hansman wrote one of my letters to go to Japan for a recommendation for me way back when I got to go on the trip with Yuki, right? So they're all tied together. I saw her at the Starbucks across the street from DePaul, and she was so excited to hear that she ran across DePaul, knocked over some bags of coffee, and gave me a hug. She is just a dream. If anyone's at DePaul, or maybe you just want to audit a class, she is everything you'd want, just like Yuki, and someone to support you and to share information with you and to help you learn.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you to Dr. Hanson for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Miyamoto, for being here as well and having these conversations with us. Thank you, chat. There's this. I was keeping eyes and for on your conversations as well. And sorry, I appreciate you bringing that into the vocal space because it's been very cool that chat too is engaging on these conversations as well. And I hope that you'll be able to take those into other spaces and continue to tackle that sort of perspective in anything.
Truth. And Yuki I feel like you have a bunch of new things published that are really cool out there right now. She even, you have an article on tokusatsu, is that right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah. So there's lots of more sources from Yuki out there if you want to learn more. Her classes and her content is so important. And
It's all about mass slaughter, though, I must say.
It's more than
I can't help.
Because of Yuki, actually, maybe I don't know how many years ago now, I was able to meet a Hiroshima maiden. That's the kind of work that Yuki does. She brought her here to Chicago. So yeah.
Right, yeah.
Right on.
Mm-hmm. Casper, I also feel like you didn't get to introduce yourself in the beginning because no one could hear you.
Right.
Would you like to introduce yourself again now?
At the end, that would be a great bookend, I would say. Yeah, for everyone who's still here, and there seems like a fair amount of people still here as well. So thanks for sticking with us and giving me a second chance at introducing myself. So those who have heard it, which I think is probably just Derek and Sarah. So I'm going to repeat myself in my bad jokes or bad quips. You know, I love Japanese culture. It started with Transformers, with a young version of me and a transforming robot. I went to the first PopCon, the first convention, I think it was like 93 or 94. And I saw the Japanese exclusive Transforms that I didn't know existed until then. And then that kind of opened up a new world for me, collecting, you know, more little pieces of plastic. And then extended out the animation aisle at Blockbuster. So seeing Robotech at a young age, a lot of Ninja Scroll, a lot of those really early animes got me into that as well. And then so I've just fallen in love with Japanese culture, try to hit Tokyo or Osaka once a year if you know, if a pandemic didn't exist. I love ramen and Japanese pro wrestling is probably one of my biggest passions. So you know, anyone wants to talk about that, I'm always open for a conversation about that.
And you can go back and watch the episode in which Casper was a guest to talk about that.
It's in the archives. I have a really big bad mustache, so it's like the bizarro evil version of me. Maybe that's on that one. So, but trust me, we're the same. We're the same person.
I thought it was a great mustache. I was a little shocked you shaved it, but you know.
You said bizarre, and I just imagined a Casper with making like Waluigi sounds. Just.
But I'm not sure if the with mustache or without mustache, which is the evil, which is the good version. So we're still trying to figure that one out.
See, you're already asking critical questions. Yeah.
Yes. Tune in later to find out about that.
And yes, as a, you know, tidbit, maybe you didn't hear that Derek is not going to be on the next Tokyo House Party, but we will still have Derek around, in spirit at the very least. And the next Tokyo House Party will be, hear the music outside, will be led by Casper, actually. And you want to give everyone a little glimpse into what that will be?
Sure. The theme, the broad theme is going to be collecting. So we are putting together an episode with another collector, dealer, man of mystery, I think, talking about a specific Japanese art form. Myself, I will be talking about like my adventures in collecting, traveling out there, how it's evolved over the years, because I think the first time I went over there was about 2003, and being a collector going over there back then is very different than what it's like right now. Accessibility, what's those grand themes, how Akihabara has changed over the years, things like that. So it'll be I'll be talking about the geeky stuff, the video games, the toys, the action figures, and things like that.
And yes, Tuned Low, all kinds of collecting. Yes, particularly different forms of art of all the levels.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I feel like, chat, are there any other questions before we bid you farewell for this night? Because, you know, you've really hung out with us for a while and put in some time and a lot of really great questions. And thank you so much. Thank you so much.
There's one final, not quasi plug, but you know, you can follow and you can also subscribe to the channel. So one thing a lot of people don't know is if you have an Amazon Prime subscription, you have technically one free Twitch subscription that you can subscribe to a channel. So all you have to do is just connect your Twitch account to your Amazon Prime, and then if you go ahead and subscribe to us, that would help us out a ton.
Yes.
Little known fact, I didn't know that until a couple months ago, that you get that free Twitch subscription.
Yes. And you can follow us on Instagram, which is, I think, the place we're most active right now. It's Japanese Arts Foundation. You can also make donations to the Japanese Arts Foundation, I should say. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization here in Chicago. So we are kind of the parent to this program. So yeah, and we're doing all kinds of cool things this summer. You won't want to miss out on it. And as the world opens up, I'm sure you'll see some really cool things we're doing in the fall.
Absolutely.
It's hot as heck in my room right now, guys. It's so hot in here.
Well, let's not keep you next to a whirring PC any longer.
I think Derek gets final words since he's gonna do his hiatus. Anything else you want to say to the wonderful people out there?
Chat, it's been an absolute wonderful ride getting to conduct Tokyo House Party with you, even though I'm stepping away temporarily. You're absolutely going to see me poking my head in, you know, to a lot of the conversations to the future and being a part of the audience along with you. Yeah, other than that, you can continue to see my other ongoings online as I continue to create games, continue to have these types of conversations in my own spaces, and look forward to that. So I'll be releasing a video game this year. I briefly mentioned Onsen Master and working on another one, and specifically continuing to have the conversations and explore the intersections of Black and Japanese culture. Might be talking about a certain African samurai a little more in the future.
I put Onsen Master in chat earlier.
Oh, did the chatbot eat that up by chance?
Nope, I did it after you let me do the things.
There you go. I appreciate it. But that's it. I think that wraps a pretty stellar Tokyo House Party episode.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Yuki, thank you for staying up all night with us.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. This is wonderful. This is a wonderful program. And I just remember that a friend of mine who is teaching in Korea, she actually wrote an article about female pro wrestling, I think, in Japan.
Yeah.
So,
I will have to seek that from you.
Yeah. But thank you for having me. It's always so much pleasure to work with you all. And thank you.
I have a feeling you'll be seeing Yuki again come August. Just a hunch, but we'll see if we can talk her into it. Yeah. Very
exciting. Thank you again, Yuki. Chat, please enjoy the rest of your evenings. Enjoy this now hot summer. Chotsui. Like, it's so hot. But that is it for now. Look forward to more updates on the upcoming episode of Tokyo House Party. More from our new host Casper, more from our amazing host Sarah, and we'll see you next time. Bye.